Sergeant Bergdahl is back in the U.S. after nearly 5 years in the hands of the Taliban. His plane landing overnight in San Antonio, Texas, Brooke Medical Center there, the next stop on his road to recovery. He will also face questions from investigators and lawmakers. So what exactly do they want to know? Republican Congressman Wittman from Virginia is a member of the House Armed Services Committee. Good morning, Congressman.
Good morning, Arthel. Great to be with you.
Thank you so much. And I want to start with, what do you and your congressional colleagues want to know?
Well, we're anxious to have the Army do the analysis of what led to Sergeant Bergdahl's capture. What happened with that prior to that? There's a lot of information floating around out there, and we are concerned about making sure we understand what led up to that. We want to make sure we get the information so we understand the full context in which they made a decision to exchange Sergeant Bergdahl for these 5 high-value Taliban detainees. Obviously, we want to do everything we can to get our members of the military back, but we also want to understand how these decisions are made, especially with the risk associated with these detainees potentially returning back to the battlefield and endangering Afghans and endangering Americans.
So what do you think, though, Sergeant Bergdahl could tell authorities in terms of exactly what happened in terms of the negotiations to get him back on American soil ultimately?
Well, hopefully there'll be some perspective that he can share about his time there with the Taliban, potentially some intelligence that would be valuable to the United States. I think all those things are part of their process in debriefing Sergeant Bergdahl. So there might be some value to the United States and information that they can gather from there to make sure that we are continuing our effort to decrease the Taliban's ability to perpetrate violence and destruction against Americans and those forces that are sympathetic to America.
And Congressman, of course, there's going to be a psych evaluation. What might that involve, and how much should that determine how quickly they begin to grill Bergdahl?
Well, obviously, it's a very fragile situation. We want to make sure we're respectful of Sergeant Bergdahl. We want to make sure that we get him back to a state where he can productively communicate with us about the things that he's gone through. So I think that's a very careful process that they will go through to make sure they evaluate his full mental health state, understand where that is, so that we can be most productive in understanding all the circumstances surrounding his capture, what happened during his time of detention, and then potentially now what he can divulge to us from that time in captivity.
What if Sergeant Bergdahl is determined mentally unstable?
Well, that's something that we'll have to determine once that point is reached. I think it's a little premature now to determine what might happen from that particular standpoint. Obviously, it would impact what information we might be able to obtain from him, but I want to make sure that they give him the full evaluative process to make sure they determine where he is from a psychological standpoint and where we can go forward to be most productive in getting useful information from him.
And then after the questions are answered, what's the next step?
Well, the next step is to make sure we determine how this decision was made in the full context of the risk associated with the United States. One of the big concerns that I have is, why did they determine that these 5 Taliban prisoners were the ones that they were going to exchange for Sergeant Bergdahl? By the administration's own evaluation in 2010, they said that these 5 detainees should not be released, and even the conjecture about under which conditions they should be released were not even clear. And we know, too, the country that they were released to, Qatar, in 2008. A detainee was sent to Qatar. Qatar was asked to detain this individual under certain conditions. They didn't even follow those conditions. We look at the agreement today versus what happened in 2008.
Yeah. Congressman,
the conditions much different.
I beg your pardon, but I want to jump in with this final point here and ask you, because I see where you're going with the information you're trying to glean from whatever Sergeant Bergdahl may tell them. But I wonder, does he have access to really kind of what happened in negotiations? I wonder if he'll have those answers.
You know, I don't know. I'm certain that he doesn't at this particular point, but we want to make sure from our standpoint and how we evaluate all the different decisions that went into this, that we understand why this was in the U.S. best long-term interest and why we were not endangering Americans elsewhere or American interests around the globe by releasing these 5 Taliban leaders. We know who have associations with the Haqqani network, have associations with Al-Qaeda. I think that's the important thing to understand here is, you know, how that determination was made. That, I think, is the crux to the issue.
Understood. Congressman Wittman, thank you so much for your time this morning.
Thank you.
On that same